Hi, today we're going to take a look at two fast 135mm lenses for E-mount cameras. So let's check them out. Today we're testing two 135 fast prime lenses for E-mount cameras. The Sony FE 135mm f1.8 GM and the Samyang AF 135mm f1.8 FE lens. The Sony has been around since February 2019, while the Samyang was announced in early 2022 at a significantly reduced price. But how does this reflect in our testing? Well, let's take a look. As always, we will start with the optical design, and the Sony has 13 elements in 10 groups, including one XD element, one Super ED element, and one ED element. The Samyang also has 13 elements, but it has 11 groups, including one UASP element, 2 HR elements, and 3 ED elements. Moving over to materials, and both lenses seem to be well made from hard plastic or composite material. The Sony has a different, slightly more robust feel, similar to many other recent GM lenses. When it comes to size and weight, the Sony is a bit heavier at almost 1 kg compared to just over 800 grams for the Samyang. The two lenses are almost identical in size at 13.5 centimeters, and the Samyang feels a hair wider at just over 8.5 centimeters. The Sony has two rings, a front fairly wide focus ring and a narrow rear aperture ring. The focus ring is smooth with very good resistance. The aperture ring can move in clicks or smoothly and has an automatic mode, which we really like. The Samyang has a single, very wide ring which can be used for focus or be programmed via the Samyang dock for controlling the aperture. It works fine, but it is not as smooth as the focus ring on the Sony. There is also a difference in the texture of both rings between the Sony and the Samyang. Both provide, however, a good amount of grip. The Sony is packed with buttons and switches. It has a manual and autofocus switch, focus limiter with 3 modes, as well as a declick switch on the other side. It also has 2 programmable focus hold buttons. The Samyang has a custom switch that features 2 modes that you can set via the Samyang docking station and software to change between manual focus and autofocus or aperture control. The Samyang also has the same focus limiter and a single autofocus hold button. Both lenses have weather sealing and cover a full-frame sensor and come in an E-mount version only. Another thing in common is that both lenses have a 7 cm plastic hood. The Sony hood has a black fabric inside to prevent reflections and a small release button. Finally, both lenses have 11 aperture blades and both also share the same 82mm front filter thread. Moving over to performance and focusing, let's start with manual focus. The Sony has a superb manual focusing with a fantastic ring that moves super smoothly. The Samyang focusing ring on our copy of the lens doesn't seem to have the same smoothness as the Sony does, otherwise it works fine and does what it should. We also tested the focus throw of both lenses. The Sony has a linear focus throw of about 90 degrees. The Samyang has a non-linear focus, which means that the slower you turn the lens, the longer the focus throw will be. This is not ideal for repeatable work in video. Now, this is at least theoretically possible that in the future, Samyang will be able to change this via a firmware update, but for now, this is what you get from the lens. Next, we move to the autofocus test. This is where a lot of differences between first and third-party lenses can be found these days. We tested both lenses in stills and in video, shooting 2 targets at about 3 meters apart in both lit and ultra dim conditions. To our surprise, with our Sony A1 we could not see any visible differences in both good and poor lighting conditions and in stills or video modes. Both lenses performed excellently, and as long as we got the square on the target, both lenses focused right away very quickly. We also wanted to test tracking, and we tested both lenses shooting in a skateboard park with our A1 using electronic shutter at the fastest burst speed and got about the same keeper rate from both lenses. It is worth mentioning that officially the Sony 135mm GM can go up to 30 frames per second with the A1 while the Samyang can't. However, in our testing we could hardly see any difference in performance and they both performed exceptionally fast on our A1. Both lenses do not offer image stabilization, which would have made them even larger and more expensive, although we would kind of like to see a fast stabilized 135mm lens by this point. As we always do, we tested the sharpness of both lenses using our special large professional IMA test high-end chart on our Sony A1. Looking at the center of the frame wide open, the Sony might be a hair sharper, but with the aberration corrections turned off, it is noticeably darker. Both lenses, however, are very good at f1.8 and exceptionally sharp at f2.8. Moving over to the corners, we would say that both lenses are equally sharp and demonstrate excellent performance even wide open. Again, with the auto corrections turned off, the Sony is visibly darker. When it comes to close-up performance, both lenses are quite impressive. The Sony can focus as close as about 68 cm, significantly closer than most 85mm lenses for example, and the Samyang is even better at 66 cm. The macro magnification of both lenses is also pretty decent with 1:4 for the Sony and 1:4.1 for the Samyang. Not macro, but still pretty good. Looking at the image quality close up, we will say that the Sony is maybe slightly sharper than the Samyang in the center wide open. As for the corners, these are very hard to judge because of the close-up nature of the test and the extreme shallow depth of field which is involved in this test. Looking at breathing, both lenses seem to suffer from a ton of breathing as you can see in our video. We also decided to see how the Sony 135GM, which has a breathing compensation support, will function on our A7 IV. To our surprise, it seems that the compensation in this case does not eliminate the breathing completely, but it does seem to help. On our test, both lenses seems to exhibit no trace of longitudinal chromatic aberrations, even wide open. Certainly impressive. On the other hand, both lenses seems to be pretty susceptible to direct front light and strong flare, even with the hood, so try to avoid this as much as possible. With the aberrations corrections turned off in the camera, the Sony 135GM actually shows a lot of darkening in the corners, which clears only somewhere between f4 and f5.6. The Samyang shows a slightly different story. Wide open, the image is very dark and we are also presented with a lot of darkening in the corners. However, at f2.8, things clears up across the frame and in the corners, and it is almost gone between f2.8 and f4. Both lenses present no visible barrel distortion or pincushion distortion, even with the autocorrection turned off in the camera. The bokeh of both lenses is good and fairly similar. In some places, the Sony bokeh balls looks better, and in other places, those of the Samyang. So we can call it a tie. We used both lenses with our Sony A1 in different situations, and here are a few sample images from both of them, including a concert where we used the Sony 135mm from a distance of about 10 to 15 meters in very difficult lighting conditions. We also shot a very special fashion/beauty production recently for a high-end strobe system that we are currently reviewing. Those are going to be edited images, but we shot with both lenses and there was really no need to add any sort of post-sharpening to the images. Finally, we decided to shoot some action shots at the skate park with both lenses. We got some okay shots, but we also had some misses with both lenses, although this is more likely to be related to human error than some sort of hardware limitations. So let's conclude. While 135mm might not be as popular as 85mm for portrait work, if you have the distance, it can reward you with some fantastic results, especially with the two outstanding lenses that we have tested today. From a build quality perspective, both are very well made, with an advantage to the Sony, which also has a few extra features like the declick mechanism and extra aperture ring. The Samyang, on the other hand, is quite a bit lighter, although a hair thicker. Looking into the performance of the two lenses, we would say that despite searching very hard, both lenses seem to produce almost exactly the same results. That is to say, fantastic images with very little weak spots. When having to choose between the two lenses, it boils down to how much you're willing to spend on the improved build, design, and extra features of the Sony, such as the aperture ring and declick option. However, at the end of the day, you're definitely not going to go wrong with any one of these lenses. When it comes to pricing, there is a big difference between the two lenses. The Samyang currently sells for just under $1,000, while the Sony sells for $2,100. So that was our look at the Sony and Samyang 135mm f1.8 lenses. You can check out the full review with all of our test results on lensvid.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. See you next time.